And final presentation of the day, especially yet another RPG design topic. This was not necessarily planned per se, but Finland is doing so many RPG games nowadays, which is wonderful to see, and therefore we are going to enjoy yet another talk in that field. And of course, as we already discussed, and Petter very well pointed out, that designing RPG, well, is very, very challenging. Doesn't matter of what scope you decide to go with. The most important thing is, and especially avoid doing it as a first game, let's put it that way. So now we are going to hear a talk from seasoned game designer working very much on RPGs, and I'm hoping to find just a second. I will have to actually ask the person to do this with me as I introduce to the stage, because there are files that I want to make sure not something wrong to happen. So, next on our agenda is design and development of RPGs in 30 minutes apparently, because topic is huge, so this is just scratching the surface. And I'm so happy to have Arto Kostinen from Random Potion, as said, seasonal game designer from games industry, who has been working on so many different projects in the past, who will be sharing his wisdom with us. So Arto, welcome to the stage, and please let's make sure that, it seems that, I just want to make sure that we have the right file and all.
Okay, it's that one, yeah.
It's that one.
Yeah, design and development, yes.
Wonderful. And I will just make sure. Apologies for this.
Yeah.
You know how it is.
Yeah.
Welcome to the game dev.
Yeah.
Here we go. The stage is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so hey, welcome to my talk about design and development of role-playing games in 30 minutes. Short topic, not much to talk about. I'm sure I'll easily get through everything in 30 minutes. And my name is Arto Kostinen. I've been in the game industry since 2007, and I founded my first company in 2009 and second in 2017. And I've been part of several RPGs. Some of them I've been lead designer, lead coder, some of them smaller parts. Puzzle Quest Warlords, don't get too excited, it was a Java mobile port of the original Puzzle Quest, although it was a bit different because we actually remade all the storylines and everything because we couldn't fit the actual Puzzle Quest in the Java mobile. So I did some writing there and some design. Criminal's Hammer of Thor was an iOS game that won the Unity Award for best mobile game or best iPhone game at the time. Rule on the Shadow Engine was a JRPG style RPG for Power Park. Knights of Pen and Paper 2 I did some side quest for. And then we did the Dark Eye Book of Heroes based on this German tabletop role-playing game. It was a procedurally generated multiplayer RPG. And now I'm working on Ignis Universia, Spa of Destiny. That is a kind of lighter RPG, parodic animation style. And Dice Work game logo, Random Potion logo. And apparently these animation orders in PowerPoint are messed up, so I'm sorry about that. This is the game I'm working on now. It's called different in Steam right now, but anyway. So this talk is mostly based on my writings on randompotion.com. You can get more in-depth information there. So let's start with the question, is it hard to make an RPG? People often say that RPGs are one of the hardest genres of games to make, but is it really true? I mean, they have existed since the dawn of computing, so we have to think about what's an RPG, what was an RPG back then, and what's an RPG now, and what are the expectations. It is easy to make D&D that was made in 1974, but it's hard to make Baldur's Gate 3 that was made, ultimately released in 23. Like, this is what D&D in 74 looked like, and everybody knows that this is what Baldur's Gate looks like. And so yeah, when we're talking about is it hard to make an RPG, it really depends on what kind of RPG you're making. And like, so what do you need to make an RPG? You need characters, like yeah, it's a role-playing game, so you have to have some kind of roles to play, or some kind of roles that take place in the game's world. You usually need to have some kind of exploration. I think that's a very important aspect for most players, that you can get to explore dungeons, game world, some places. And I use dungeons like very widely, like a city can be a dungeon too, or a spaceship can be a dungeon. Usually you have items, something to collect, swords to equip, laser pistols to shoot with, and so on. And you have quests. Maybe you have just one quest, go and kill the evil wizard, or maybe you have like hundreds of quests, like in modern, like Baldur's Gate or Witcher games. So basically, a role-playing game is a game where characters explore dungeons to gain better attributes in order to complete one or more quests. That is basically the definition of RPG I'm going to use in this talk. So if we are going to make a game that has these elements, is it going to be hard? What do we need for it? So how do we approach making an RPG? So I've broken the RPGs to basically a few parts. From design and development perspective, it basically consists of these parts. There's the data model. You have to have some kind of data model that is like your character stats, that's items, that's enemies, that's everything that's data in your game. And that can be like simple. You may have just one spreadsheet of information, and that's a very simple data model. Nothing interacts with each other. Or you may have a very complex data model where different things influence each other in different ways, and you have a ton of different equations that define it. So the more complex your data model is, the harder the RPG is going to be to make. Then there's level environments, like that's the content of the game. Like the way to explore, and the more environments you have, the harder, or it's not necessarily harder, the longer it takes to make, because environments are one of the big blocks. Like if you, in Book of Heroes, we actually had just two environments. We had the kind of dwarven dungeon and we had the forest. And that game was in production for like 3 years or something. Obviously you can use shortcuts, you can use assets, and like pre-made assets you can do it a bit faster, but anyway, each environment needs levels, it needs art, it needs sound, it needs a lot of things. So environments are a big part of how big an RPG is and how complex or time-consuming it is to make. And then there's my fine term, autonomous interactive objects, that basically encompasses all things that move around and that you can interact with, like player characters, enemies, NPCs, sometimes other objects that may have some kind of code that determines how they, like traps, for example, can be autonomous. They can have some kind of code that determine how it interacts with the environment and with the player. And then there's the narrative framework, which is, especially in modern days, like narrative is seen as a very important part of RPGs, and how you approach the narrative has a great influence on how complex your game is going to be. Like, is it just that you have a few dialogues that you click through, or do you have branching dialogue? Do you have actions that influence the dialogues? Do you have dialogues that influence the actions? And that, like, you can have a very complex mess very easily with the narrative framework. So each of these is kind of a multiplier to how complex and how time-consuming development of an RPG is. But when you're beginning, you need to make some decisions. And I was like, a few years ago, I was talking about like how do you know, like what makes a good RPG? And then I started thinking like it's a weird question because good is very subjective. So I started basically thinking about like what kind of RPGs do we have, like how do we even categorize RPGs, and I came up with this 4-axis model. So each RPG is places somewhere on these 4 scales. And very few games actually fall into either extremes. Their scales, so every game is somewhere left or right, or however you want to view them axis. So there's randomness versus determinism. So some games are more random, there's more dice rolls, there's like more procedural generation, everything changes a lot more like via random ways, or some games are more deterministic, like all the actions have always the same conclusions. Sometimes the battles can be more random and the game otherwise more deterministic. Sometimes everything is random, sometimes the whole game is more deterministic. Like for example in dialogues, if there's like dialogues that unlock when you have a certain skill level, you can have either like, okay, this always unlocks when your skill is 5 or more, or this only unlocks if you roll something when you start the dialogue. And then there's mechanics versus content. So you can have a very mechanics or procedural based game, like for example any kind of roguelike is a very mechanics based game. It has much less content compared to like big games like, or like content heavy games like let's say the Elder Scrolls Saga. So it's either very mechanic based or very content based. Also of course somewhere in the middle. And then there's story versus freedom. So you either follow a very pre-written story very closely, or you have a lot of freedom on the other hand. So on the other hand, there's games where you basically just go through a story. On the other hand, there's like sandbox games where you can do pretty much what you want. There may be a main storyline, and you can or maybe even have to follow it, but you don't have to follow it directly. Like you can go do stuff in meanwhile and so on. And then there's options versus approachability. I think this is one of the important ones to think about, because basically the more options you have in your game, the more cumbersome it is for the player to approach. Like you can make a very approachable game with a very few options, and a lot of like even newcomers to the genre for them it will be easier to pick it up. Or you can make a game like let's say, well, I don't know if you count Crusader Kings as a RPG. I think some people do, but that's like the other way. Like that has so many options, it's like almost unlimited, but it's also not approachable at all. You need to watch like 3 hours of YouTube videos just to get started with the game. So I'd say all RPGs are on these 4 scales somewhere. I will talk a bit more about where some games fall later, or like Steam games. So now that we have gotten some theory, let's talk about scoping, which is the like second thing. Basically, when you start making an RPG, you decide kind of, okay, I want to make a game that is like about this. It's a bit more mechanics based, maybe a bit more free. So how do you start scoping it? There are 2 of these axes like relate directly to the scope of the game. Mechanics is basically always smaller scope, and content is always larger scope, because content involves more people, or it involves more work from one person if it's a one-person game. But more content there is, more time consuming the game is to make. Mechanical game might be a more complex one to make, but it usually takes less time. And usually approachable games are a bit smaller scope, although they might take a lot more time, like just polishing everything, than like options heavy games that have a larger scope, because those options create a lot more complexity in the system that needs to be tested out. And yeah, complex data model usually means exponentially more scope. So if it's a large data model, you have you have hundreds of items, but all of them are just bunch of stats. That's like a linear complexity. Linear scope, but if those items interact with characters and different items, and you have different item combos, then it's a more complex data model that likes exponential growth to the scope. And level environment greatly adds to the scope. You need a lot of things for level, like art. The actual level art, you usually need the level like entities, you need the monsters, the NPCs to the environment, and so on. So they are a big, like if you decide to add a new environment, it's going to be a big chunk of the project. And autonomous in the objects depends on the objects. Some of them might be easy to add if it's a very complex character or NPC that has like very many levers that you can pull on, like how it acts as a very complex AI, then it will take more time to make and test. And narrative frameworks can be a multiplier. Obviously, if you have a very non-linear narrative, that will multiply the content of your game. And also, detailed characters, voiced characters, they take a lot more time to make. And when making RPGs, I would say that pre-production is king. Like, you really need to spend a lot of time in pre-production, because if you don't, that's gonna bite you in the ass. It has bitten me in the ass in pretty much every project. Because indies don't have time for pre-production apparently. Because complex game projects are wrought with bottlenecks. There's always like, okay, I need to do this, but I can't do this because this previous thing hasn't been done. And a lot of those previous things are often related to pre-production. Like, thorough pre-production lessens the risk of team having to wait for design, narrative, and so on. And also it lessens risk for else. So you should, like in pre-production, should have a story synopsis that is as detailed as possible. Like not just 2 pages, it should be like 50 pages for like a 10-hour game, let's say. For a longer game, it should be probably 300 pages. It should be as detailed as possible, so you can pick up as many problems in advance as possible. Obviously, never all of them, but as many as possible. Also, that detailed battle design, you should have a clear idea like how enemies work, which abilities they have, what kind of challenges they pose to the player, and like in as much detail as possible. And obviously you should have a very solid combat prototype in pre-production, so you don't have to remake the combat in mid of the project. And this I have never tried, but I would next time I make an RPG, I would probably make this kind of game-wide white box prototype. Basically, the whole story as a white box. Like actually as simple white box, just cubes or whatever, just to play through the story once. That would help a lot. And that would also give you some kind of an idea of the flow of the game and also of how long it takes to complete. And then a bit about code architecture, since I promised in the description. Avoid hard coding stats. I see so many tutorials online that are like, okay, you have to make an RPG first, you write int strength, int intelligence. No, don't do that, use a dictionary. There's more on my website about that too. Make a game state stack, so you have, like if you have game state, have them stacked together, you have an adventure state, on top of adventure state you have a dialogue state, and so on. Persistence is very important, so between levels and between games, so between scenes, like if you exit one scene, usually in modern game engines treat everything in scenes. So you have a scene that's a castle and you go to the forest next to the castle. You have to know and save like where, okay, which exit did you use to go to the forest, so when you come back, like which exit did you use to move the player to the correct entrance in the other level, and so on. And of course between sessions, so basically save games. Really design these code-wise very early on. And yeah, plan data storage early, like where do you get your data? Is it, if you use Unity, is it scriptable objects? Please don't use scriptable objects, use some kind of better, like even like spreadsheets are better. I guess Unity has a bit better tools nowadays, but at least in my version they just crash, so. And testing tools are very important, because RPGs are very complex things to test. So you have to think about 2 things like destructive and non-destructive cheats. Destructive cheats are basically if you use these cheats, then your save will not be comparable to a vanilla game anymore. So let's say a destructive cheat is like adding experience points is a destructive cheat, adding items is a destructive cheat. And then there are non-destructive cheats. For example, like skipping dialogues is non-destructive usually. Like adding damage to one attack is non-destructive because it's just one attack, and so on. So you usually want to think about cheats as destructive and non-destructive, so you know that if these destructive cheats have been used on a save, that save is not comparable to a real game anymore, and you will have to test everything after that, like again for release. And do a save game manager. You need to have 1 million different save game files, so make a good save game manager so you can easily like, okay, I need to test this, or I need to go there to they'll make a new feature there, so you have a save that you can just load the party, load whatever you need, and have everything like as it would be in a real game. And also, if possible, autoplay. This has saved so much time. If you can have your characters basically have simple AI, you play your characters just to play through the game on their own. Obviously, in complex games, this is almost impossible, but at least on some parts of the game, it already helps a lot. So you can just put the autoplay on and wait to see if it crashes. And then about the market of the RPGs. So basically, there's games from Minute to Baldur's Gate 3. I don't know how many know Minute. It's a very small 1 minute RPG, very popular. And in Steam, the total RPG revenue is 16.4 billion, so 26% of Steam revenue comes from RPGs. These are according to Gameanalytics. But median revenue of an RPG is 1.8 thousand, so that's not much. And the average price of an RPG is $10, and average playtime is 8.8 hours. So RPGs are pretty long on average on Steam. And here's a breakdown of how many games sell, how much the Big Blue is less than, was it less than 1K? Yeah, less than 1,000. So 44% of RPGs on Steam make less than 1,000. But there's a sizable chunk of plus million games too. So I would say that RPG market is not bad. It's not a bad market to be in, but you need to really think like which part of the RPG market you want to be in. And if you think about Steam and the 4-access model, like what kind of RPGs are popular on Steam, because not all of them are as popular as others. I would say that they are simply as an average prefer randomness. So they like games that are random because that makes them usually more replayable. Same thing with mechanics. Mechanics heavy rather than content heavy. More freedom than story. And they like options rather than approachability. It's more like a gamer market. On mobile, you would probably go more for approachability. In Steam, you should probably go more for options. But obviously, my own game is going for approachability. Determinism, basically complete opposite of this one. So, I still have surprisingly much time. I've been very fast. So, should you make an RPG? The big question. Maybe not as a first project. I would not say that your first project should be an RPG. Maybe you can have like 1 or 2 elements for an RPG in your first project, but a full-on RPG, maybe not. Unless it's like you're just a part of the team and the others are more experienced. But if it's your team's first project, RPG is not usually the best idea, unless you are all experienced, obviously, in games. And scope to your skill level, don't make it too complex. Go do what you know, don't try too many new things. Like if you have never done procedural generation and you have never done multiplayer, then maybe don't do both, just do one of them. And emphasize your team skill set. So if you have, let's say, an art-heavy team, or design code-heavy teams, like then you emphasize mechanic options and larger data model because that's what you're gonna be good at. And art-heavy teams should probably emphasize content, more level story, and more level environments. If you have balance, then you can find a balance between those. But try to make the game that your team is going to be good at. You don't want to make a very mechanics-heavy game and have a huge art department that's just waiting for the others to finish their code tasks. And yeah, I guess I have a bit of time left, so let's go shortly to the battle design. So design process for a battle system, roughly. What actions does the player take and when? That's the important, that's where you start with, what are the actions that the player takes in these games and when does the player take those actions? Is it real time? Is it turn-based? What are the attacks? What are the abilities? Is there movement? Do your characters move in the battlefield? Do you stay put? And if they move, they move freely? Do they use a grid or do they use some kind of other path system? How does the system determine the results of an action? So basically, how does your randomness work? Do you have randomness? Do you have dice rolls? Do you have a card system? Do you have some kind of more complex probability system like modern games often do? And also, why do you don't pick something just because you've seen the World of Warcraft do it. Think about like what is actually good for your game, what supports the message you are trying to send with your game, and what supports the other systems. And how can most importantly, how can the player affect the results above? So, what are the skills? What is the character progression? Like, how does the player have some kind of hand in the character progression? What kind of items do they have? Can they equip the items? Do they have consumable items, and so on? And how is the result communicated to the player? This is one thing that I think a lot of RPGs often fail in. Like, how do you know how your action, what your action did and why it did so? Like UI, verbosity, like do you tell the player like, okay, you hit and here's the damage? Or do you tell them you hit with this dice roll, attacking this with this spell, and so on. You can also have options related to this, like some people like it more verbose than others. Like what kind of floaters you have, what kind of animations you have. For example, animations can be tricky in real-time games, like if you have a character who's wielding a sword and then they like just attacking an enemy and at the same time the enemy attacks the character. What happens like that? Does the attack animation go through or does it immediately play the hit animation? Both are kind of not preferable, some both will look weird. How do you deal with situations like that? And yeah, that was actually it. There's a lot more in-depth stuff about this on randompotion.com. I have last article is from I think last summer, so I've been very active there. And yeah, I think time for questions.
Olavi. Thank you, Arto. So, we do have time for a few questions,
yes.
Or at least one, bigger one. So, and I'm sure there must be some. So please give me hands up if you have a question and I will come with the mic. So any questions or comments? I have for you guys, how many of you are actually maybe potentially working on RPG at the moment? So any questions that you would like to share, or maybe your experience that you want to add to something that Arto has been saying? Huh? Maybe? Okay, we have here? Think about it. Because this is all about sharing and caring.
What do you think if I would make like a meta framework around game engine and make one system at a time? So I have already done some system of the RPG, so yeah. I can, when I have time, I can go full development.
Yeah.
So my question is, what do you think? Should I make some kind of meta framework, or I should develop when I have full time?
I think you usually should start with what's the core of your game, test what's the new thing about your game, or what's the thing you're most excited about, and do a prototype of that. And then start thinking about meta after that, because that will usually teach you a lot about the game, and that will also teach you a lot about what the meta will need when you have a small, not a vertical slice, but a small prototype of the core systems.
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. All right. And with that said, Arto, thank you so much for joining us. I will be actually joining to the stage to give some more info what's coming up next. But big applause for Arto. Thank you, Arto, so much. And now, just a bit of a reminder, since we have completed the seminar section for this year's assembly. However, there are still 2 workshops happening, one starting straight away here, which is Fantasy Console Game Development by Perttu, or more known as Borb, Tuovinen from Borbware. And this will be with Pico 8, TIC 80, Picotron, and so on. So this here, you can just straight away join, starting now till 5. And then from 5 o'clock, we have board game design with Dina Ramze. So same place and same way. So with that said, I wish to thank you all for joining us today at Artec seminars and workshops, and we are very much looking forward to the next year's edition and all programs that we are going to share in the next round. Thank you for joining us.